R.B.Hall. You have to start with some R.B.Hall, right? Because that's what we're talking about. It's the music. That was Independencia, which was written and dedicated to the International Order of Oddfellows. We'll get into that more as we go through the talk. You know, one thing we know is if you did something, you know, if you had some kind of association with R.B.Hall, or you know, invited him out, you know, for dinner or something like that, he'd write a song for you. You know, he'd write a march. You know, he had a long association with the Oddfellows, so he wrote several marches and dedicated them to the Oddfellows. And we're going to hear one a little while later that was the Oddfellow group in Pennsylvania requested that he write a song and put specific tunes in it, which is common during that time. So in order to understand R.B.Hall, we really have to understand the background of R.B.Hall and the background of the times. Now, we have to remember that he lived from 1858 to 1907. And that's a really important piece of information because, you know, we take for granted a lot of things that we have now. But back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the ability to have music or, you know, some of the social life that you would get in the city, you didn't get in the rural areas. And so there's certain functionality that goes along with bands and how you write music and the themes that you use. When we think about bands, we have to go back to the Civil War. And there's lots and lots of bands. There's hundreds of bands around at that point. And during the Civil War, it was really important that towns had bands, that military units had bands, and if you were in a bigger military unit, you got a bigger band. You know, bands might go from 10 to 25. So if you're in a brigade, you're going to get a bigger band than if you're in a smaller company where you might have what's called a serenade band, which is usually about 10 to 12 instead of 25 to 30. The bands were important from the military standpoint, in maintaining some kind of cultural order to help support the troops, to give comfort to the troops. In the Civil War, the bands also quite often led the troops into battle, and then at a certain point, they dropped out and became stretcher bearers and worked in the hospitals. And in the early part of the Civil War, there was a rule of war that you were not allowed to shoot at any medical people or stretcher bearers. So, you know, they would just put their instruments away. They would go and help carry people, you know, soldiers off the field that were injured. They'd work in the hospitals. They do a lot of you know, miscellaneous work to support the troops. They might work in the kitchen. They might do other things. And then at night, they would take out their instruments and they would play for the troops. They would play, you know, gentle songs, or if they want to kind of get the soldiers aroused a little bit more, they would play faster tunes. So before they go into the battle, the band might play some really high-level tunes to get them worked up and ready to go in and comfort them before they go. So the bands, from a military standpoint, were really, really important. And one of the things about the bands were the leaders of the units would consider the quality of the band when they're addressing the value of the unit. So it was a big competition to get the best musicians in your band, and they would be, you know, when they're mustered in, they're mustered in as musicians, and they're tested, and they're put in different places based on the skill level and the quality of the music that they do. Towards the end of the Civil War, bands were being mustered out because the fighting was going down. The War Department didn't have enough money to support all of the bands that they had. So they started to muster out the musicians. And in some cases, if the commander was upset because the War Department wouldn't pay for the musicians, the officers would actually chip in to pay the band so that they had what they considered to be a good band, because if you had a good band, people looked up to you and thinking, if you can get a good band, you must be a good unit, you must be a good commander. So it was really a competitive type of situation. Towards the end of the Civil War, as bands were being mustered out, a lot of times they were allowed to keep their uniforms, their instruments. They would go home and reform the band, or they would create new bands. And there were hundreds of bands. I think Richmond at one point, just down the street, had nine bands, 11 bands, because everyone wanted to have a band. Bands were like sports teams now, where that was where all the action was. I mean, they didn't have, radio wasn't really, very prominent. There's no TV. A lot of times the transportation isn't good enough. You're not going to go to cities to hear things. So the band became kind of a central part of the town. And in some cases, there was competition within the towns to get bands. So every school had a band. Factories had bands. Mills had bands. Fire department had a band. They would have what they call a civilian band, which wasn't necessarily connected with any factory or any organized group, but they were just people that got together. Generally, they were men, and they were generally people that, because now they'd been decommissioned, they're not in the military anymore. They wanted to maintain that group. They wanted to maintain that musicianship. So there were hundreds of bands, and there were competitions. The towns would buy uniforms, would buy instruments. They would follow the band around, like you would with sports teams now. They had a big competition in Winthrop every year. And there might be 50, 60 bands that would come, and it would last like 4 days. And the town would come and cheer on their band as part of the competition. And then they go back and they would, get back into their normal routine, so to speak. But the bands played a role of entertainment. They played all kinds of ceremonies. So someone gets married, the band plays. Someone dies, the band plays. A dignitary comes, the band plays. They have a social outing on Saturday, the band played. And it could be anywhere from, as I say, if it's a regular sized band, there's about 25. They also had the serenade band, which was a smaller group, which would play for dances indoors if you didn't have room for the full band. They would play for special events. I've seen a picture of the Waterville military band playing at the laying of the cornerstone of the brand new City Hall in 1901. And they're part of that ceremony. But that's what they did. If they need music, it was the band. And so the bands were extremely important from a social standpoint, from a music standpoint, and from kind of bringing together people in the town. The bands were also used to playing music that you might hear in a city. There might be orchestra music, music from an opera, music from a play, music that the New York Philharmonic might play that would be arranged for the band, and the band would play those, so that the bands brought all this music to the community instead of the community having to go out and get them. So you're going to see a lot of music that's opera overtures. You're going to see things like a movement from a symphony orchestra. So if they wanted to hear a Brahms piece, or if they wanted to hear Beethoven, they'd get an arrangement, they would play it, and that's how people learned about some of the music that's going on during the period. So if you see, so in this particular case, if a town, so if the group came out of the war and had their own instruments and could, they were close enough together so that they could reform the band. You can see here they have some military style uniforms. If they weren't part of a military, they would have more formal instruments. So here's the Kendall's Mills Citizens Brass Band. So you can see, that it's very informal in this particular case. It's not necessarily associated with the military. It's done as Kendall's Mills. Usually if it's a citizens band, it's just a grouping of people that aren't in a factory, or maybe they work on a farm, maybe they're working outdoors, maybe they're doing some other jobs that don't bring them into this group of mills. Early on in Hall's career, he conducted the Richmond Cornet Band. Cornet, if we think about instruments, now instruments back then are a little bit different than instruments today. First of all, they're built in high pitch, and for those that don't know what that means, it means that the pitch is about a half to a third higher than the modern pitch. And these are cornets, which means they're conical in nature, kind of like a French horn. So they start kind of narrow here and gradually get bigger until you get to the end, as opposed to a trumpet, which is the same length, but it's lineal. So it just goes out, the pipes don't flare like they do with the cornet. Now there's an interesting piece that says, why did they use cornets and not trumpets? Well, the reason was cornets have a more mellow sound. Right? If I do the same thing on a trumpet, I'm going to get a whole different sound. Right? So back then, and actually up through the 1960s into the 70s, bands used conical instruments because they blended with woodwinds better and they weren't as brassy. Trumpets were orchestra instruments because they had to be able to stand out over violins, violins and string instruments that tended to be have a little sharper tone to them. So, in fact, I played a cornet up until 1970 or something, and then what made the change was as soon as jazz came in, cornets are not jazz instruments, trumpets are jazz instruments. So as soon as they started really getting into jazz bands and that became more prominent within communities and with musicians, they started switching over to trumpets. This is a fairly common instrument in that there's a lot of the Boston three-star cornets. What makes this unusual is all the engraving, which was done by the citizens of Bangor, which I'll look at a little bit later. So the other thing is they're closer to you, so you're not having to reach out. So if you're traveling and you need more stability, this is going to give you that little extra stability instead of having to be out here like this. So all the bands had cornets. All of the bands had conical instruments, and all of them were high pitch. So this is the Waterville Military Band, which R.B.Hall conducted. You'll notice the instruments. This coat was made in about 1900. It was a coat used by the Chandler Band in Portland. And the hat, this is a little later, but the hat was kind of typical of the band uniforms that they would have. These are wool. I wear these on R.B.Hall Day. It can be very hot. But that was their uniform. they generally, if they were from a military band, they generally had a military style jacket. And what, you know, the way you could distinguish them was some of the embroidery. So this would be like a mid-level officer's jacket. If it was, you know, just a standard issue, there wouldn't be the extra scrolling in there. And if you were high up, they would be filled with embroidery, and it would you know, show your position. So this would be similar to, I'm not sure what grade they would be in for that particular time, but it would be typical of the uniform that they would play. This is the Bangor Band, which we'll talk about a little bit. The Bangor Band is one of the times when R.B.Hall really boosted his reputation. He was a taskmaster. He was very, very demanding. And if you didn't meet his standards, you didn't play in his band. And so whenever, there were several occasions, like with Bangor, a couple others, that when the band was ready to dissolve because they weren't, the quality wasn't good, they would ask R.B.Hall to come up. By that time, he'd earned a reputation that said, if you need someone to fix your band, R.B.Hall's the person to call. And so he went up and, you know, brought the band up to the standard, and as a result, the citizenry of Bangor gave him that cornet. But you can see in this, it's a little bit bigger band, not much, but it was one of those that he saved. He came from a musical background. So this is the Browne family. His mother, Virginia, who is right here, played oboe, guitar, violin. This was her family, the Browne family, who entertained throughout New England. So he was exposed to music. He was not totally involved at this point, but music was certainly encouraged. His father was a blacksmith and a cornet player who died young, and but that's where, again, R.B.Hall really got the music bug as it was. So if we kind of look at his life, he first studied violin and piano. He was a sickly young child, and his father actually discouraged him from playing the cornet because he was afraid it would kill R.B.Hall from the stress. At age 16, when his father was saying, don't do it, he was following the tradition of all teenagers that said, I'm not listening to you, I'm playing the cornet. And you can see between the age of 16 and 18, I mean, this was amazing, that he became a musician, a cornet player at age 16. By age 18, he was already performing with professional bands in Boston, both as a band member and as a soloist. And he played with several bands that were highly rated bands in Boston, and he was playing the solo parts. At 19, he became the director of the Richmond Cornet Band, which we saw, and they also asked him to compose music. Now, a lot of times, you know, we can't call up a publishing house and say, you know, ship over 2 or 3 pieces of music. They just didn't do that, right? So it was up to usually a director or someone in the band to actually write music for the group. And R.B.Hall kind of stepped up. His first 3 pieces of music were for the Richmond Cornet Band. Then in 1882, this was when Bangor had a problem with the band. They were getting ready to dissolve, and the city said, we can't let that happen. And R.B.Hall was having a big reputation, and was boosted by all of the work he did in Boston. So people would say, this guy, has been playing in Boston. He's been a soloist. He's been in all these big bands. He's conducted. He's the guy we need. And so he came in, and in a couple of years, got the band back where it needed to be in terms of the quality of the band. And at that point, the band awarded him with a gold trumpet. After that, he wrote a song for Bangor, which, so again, if you, I don't want to say this wrong, if you treated him well, he would he would most likely write you a song instead of sending a thank you note. So Bangor gives him the cornet. He doesn't send a thank you note. He writes a piece, and that's how he. Let me see. Sorry if I can get this. That's how he ends up doing his thanks. So what he wrote was this song, "Greeting to Bangor." Now, this shows that not even a pandemic can keep band members from performing. So this is a virtual performance that they did when they couldn't come together as a band. So that's Greeting to Bangor. Oops. Take the glove off. Take off with the gloves.
That song's on our list for the concert.
Yep. Yeah, and if you go to the one in Gardner, the R.B.Hall one, that's all R.B.Hall music. So you can go and enjoy even more of R.B.Hall. So at this point, we can see that we're in the kind of towards the middle of his career. After Bangor, he moved to Waterville, became the leader of a band which became known as the Waterville Military Band. And he also was the band director at Colby College. And he's maintained that position until 1907, which is when he died. He had a stroke in 1907, and basically he didn't live much longer after that, so he died fairly young. The next kind of big piece was this 10th Regiment Band. So the commander of the 10th Regiment Band in Albany contacted R.B.Hall and said, basically the band is ready to be decommissioned because it was just a crappy band. It wasn't worth the money. And he asked R.B.Hall to come and fix the band, make it more professional, make it so that they could justify. And the commander said, if I don't have a really good brass band, I'm not going to look good to the other commanders. I mean, it really became a prestige thing with the regiment. So R.B.Hall went to Albany, and he worked with the 10th Regiment. He brought them back up to beyond the minimum requirement that they had to maintain a band. And while there, he wrote several songs, we'll get into in a minute. Then he came back. He was the leader of the American Cadet Band in Portland for a while. Then he came back to Portland, to Waterville, and basically lived there. He died in his mother's house in Portland, and he's buried in Richmond. He was born in Bodenham, and he was buried in Richmond on the family plot there. In 1981, Governor Brennan approved a resolution to establish R.B.Hall Day the last Saturday in June. And every year the governor signs, whoever the governor is, signs the proclamation confirming that the last Saturday in June is when all community bands in the state are to come together or somehow honor R.B.Hall. And whether they do it locally, whether they do it as part of a statewide event, that's what that proclamation is saying. Then after that, other people kind of took over R.B.Hall. They preserved his music. A couple of his relatives kind of sold off the parts of the collection, and some of them got lost. There were over 100 pieces. He wrote not only marches, but he wrote operas, he wrote dances, he wrote things which were not considered marches. And so the question becomes, what's considered a march? Well, a march is just a form. It's not any particular type of music. It's not any, rah-rah, sis, boom, bob music. It's just a form. So the form is you have an introduction, you have a first strain that's repeated, you have a second strain that's repeated, and the second strain may have two different melodies in it. And then you have a trio, which usually is a more solemn or softer set of music. And then you have a break strain, which basically means you're setting the song up to end. And then you have, well, if you're John Philip Sousa, you have a coda and a stinger at the end. Stingers were part of music until John Philip Sousa decided he wanted to have a stinger to really make his music stand out. He also sped up the music. We're in an interesting time period here because brass band music generally was taken from the European style. So the tempos were a little bit slower. This is about what a normal band tempo, a standard band tempo would be. You'd also have a dirge, and then you would have a faster gallop, which would be, if you're playing with horses galloping by. And so the normal speed that we'd play is somewhere between 108 beats a minute and 112. John Philip Sousa changed that. He didn't like that it was so slow. One of the things that I kind of cringe with some of these recordings is they're way too fast. You can't really enjoy the music as much. If you play the music at the speed it's intended, it has a whole different tone to it. It has a whole different meaning to it. But this is what a march is. It doesn't say you're going to actually march anywhere. It doesn't say that you're actually going to be in a parade or you're going to be doing something we normally think of as march. It's a form. And part of the form of this is it provides a lot of flexibility. So if you only have a short time, you just don't play the repeats. If you need to do it for something else, maybe you slow it down in parts and you speed it up in parts. One of the things that's consistent is usually you have some kind of duple meter. So if you're thinking of marching, it's always left, right, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or if you're in a parade with horses, this is an interesting piece. Horses are like this, not like this. So if you're in a parade with horses, you tend to play 1, 2, 1, 2, as opposed to 1, 2, 1, 2, right? So you're going to hear some of these marches that have this little gallop feel to them, okay? And usually that's the only thing you're going to hear. You're not going to hear a waltz tempo in here. You're not going to hear, more like an orchestra tempo. It's always going to be based on 2, so you can march if you need to, or you can dance to it, okay? So a lot of these marches were actually used for dances. So some of the formats we have, so you can see here, it says 6/8, which is the, right? And the New Colonial is one of those that's extremely popular around the world. And it's used for marching competitions. The British bands use this a lot for their marching competitions. And so when you're doing that type of thing, you want to be able to say, I can do a slower tempo, or I can do a bigger tempo, faster tempo, depending on what you're trying to do. But if we look at the form, okay, we have the introduction, we have this section that's between, whoops, I don't want to do that. We have the section, We have, come on. So we have the section that's the first strain. You can see starts here, goes to here, repeats, goes back and plays it again. We have the second strain, which again, you play twice. And then here you have the trio, which is, you change the kind of tone of the music a little bit. Then when you get done with that, you're going to go into this break strain, which is sometimes called the dogfight. What happens is you might have 2 or 3 different groups of instruments that are playing a melody at the same time, and they're kind of fighting each other for attention, right? They're doing melodies that are in competition with each other. And so they call it, quite often they'll call it a dogfight, or it's the break strain. And then you just go out from there, and from here on, you're just doing, I keep doing that. Okay. You go out and you're doing the final section from here, so that ending piece goes from here down to here, okay? And again, you won't hear any stingers in R.B.Hall music. That he didn't. The British didn't do stingers. The British style didn't do stingers. So we have this change in how things are going. You have some bands that are still clinging to the European style with slower tempos, no stingers, and a little different tone to the music. And then you have the American style with John Philip Sousa and other composers of that particular time with similar attitudes, who are doing faster, they're doing more bombastic, they're trying to compete with each other about who can have the fastest bands. I mean, you have Patrick Gilmore, who's playing a piece where he's bringing in 21 anvils, and he's bringing in, like 500 people to play his pieces, so they're really loud, So he's doing all the blacksmiths, and he's bringing all the blacksmiths that are in Boston in, and they circle the auditorium, and they're banging on their anvils while the band of 200 is playing, and there might be a chorus of 200 or 300 in the back singing. I mean, it was these bombastic types of shows that they started doing. It became more showmanship than anything else. So as we kind of think about these, if you can understand the form and where some of this is coming from, I think you get a little better understanding of what we're doing here. So, and we can see with these things that R.B. Hall music is all over the world. I have recordings of this is actually a British march. There's some with Hungarian bands playing it. I see a marching group in Chile who's playing one of his songs. There's a group in Japan that's playing his music. I mean, it's all over the world. So we think of R.B. Hall as kind of local, but he's actually global. So if we think about the format, okay, so this is the New Colonial March, right? So if we listen to it now that we know a little bit more about the format, and then it goes back to here. You hear the trombones are doing a counter melody. And second strain, hear the trombones doing a melody while the trumpets are doing fanfares on the top. And then now they go into the trio, which is a gentle, almost folk song type thing. And it adds in instruments, but still very soft, gentle. And then we go into the break section. And then it's going to build up to get to the last section, which is the kind of the bombastic section, taking it out in a big, heavy melody. And you can hear a counter melody in the clarinets. No stinger. Never use a stinger. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here, because I think one of the ways we can, I don't want to do that. One of the ways we can see how the styles work. R.B. Hall, again, had to write for many occasions. And a couple of the songs he wrote were actually funeral dirges. The Officer of the Day actually started as a funeral march, and then he decided he wanted to make it into a faster march instead of honoring them after they died. Honor them while they're there. And there's one piece. Let me see if I can. Yeah. So he wrote this March Funumbre as a dirge, right? And he wrote it in the style of the time. Now, the style of the time, if you're familiar with New Orleans funerals, where they do a heavy dirge for the first part of the song because you're taking the person to their resting place. But the second part is a chorale, because they're going on to a better life, and now they're celebrating the fact that they may be gone, now, but they're going up to heaven, and they have a chance to celebrate the fact that they can continue their life in heaven. This song, March Funumbre, it's actually one of the official songs of the Navy. It was played at the funeral of John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. It's played for usually high-ranking officials, and it's a very kind of moving piece. But again, it's a march. I mean, you think marches for marching, and they do march to this, but it's a dirge. So it's a different kind of march. So slow. Now we're going into the chorale as they're celebrating the life. It's a much smoother, less militaristic type sound. So we'll just stop there for time. But you can hear how, again, they're marching. It follows the exact same framework as the march, but the purpose is different. So what they're trying to do with this particular case is different than what they were doing with others. How are we doing on time? Am I boring everybody here? A couple other things. A singer is where you go. You wait, so you're going, if I'm doing a stinger, right, I'm doing, it's just, they wait and put an extra note on there just to kind of show off, or just to say, now I'm done, One of the things that happened, so this particular piece, Veni Vini Vici, was one of the songs that they don't know for sure, but it was done about the time he was working with the 10th Regiment. And this is usually played like a regular march, but there's something in here that says two-step. Two-step is a dance form. Two-step is a little bit slower, and it's done in a way that you can dance. So if you think about, if they're doing this for the 10th Regiment, and some of the things I've read said, yes, it was done for the 10th Regiment. For some of the military balls, right, you've got the women in their big hoop skirts or petticoat skirts. You've got the officers and all their regalia and swords and all kinds of things. Does anyone know why why women had to wear petticoats? Keep the men at a distance so that they couldn't fool around. Yeah. That's the same thing with hoop skirts. You don't want them to get too close because you never know what might happen with that. So this is going to be generally done for a dance, a ball. And one of the things where we talked about, in some cases, what we're doing is changing how we're rearranging the music. So here's one of the things that the march form does. So if you don't have as much time, if you don't have time to go through the whole thing, you just cut out the repeats. And you just play everything once through, and you can cut the time in half, and they can all go and get their drinks and whatever they're going to get, or they can put more music in. And so when you're doing this, if you're thinking about the types of dancing to do. Now, two-step is a specific type of dance, and there's a military two-step, and there's different types of two-steps that you can use. There's a Scottish two-step, there's the military two-step, there's the Hungarian two-step. It depends on the culture that you're doing. So this is going to be played a little bit on the slow side. Whoop, sorry. Got it. This is an old instrument. Still plays very well though. So you can see it's got a little lilt to it. It's that 6/8 we were talking about, marching with horses, or a song like this where they're going up and down, bum, as they're dancing around. So it wants to have a little lilt. It's going to be a sound that's going to be not necessarily. I shouldn't be doing this. Not necessarily very bombastic, but it's going to be very gentle as people try to dance around. I shouldn't be playing that without the gloves on. These horns, when they were made, generally were not lacquered, were not protected. Modern horns are all going to be either lacquered or have a silver coating or a gold coating. These horns, you have to be careful because they're vulnerable to oils on your hand. So that's why we usually I would never play it without gloves on. But that's why we have to be very careful with this. And you can see that some of the engraving is is not very clear. It's going to happen when you have a horn that was made in 1883, and they were made by some of the best brass instrument makers in Sudbury and Boston. So that was the local center for most brass instruments. And if you wanted a really good instrument, you went to either Sudbury. This is instrument manufacturing in Sudbury. There are others that were in Boston itself. But the New England area was considered the prime place to get really excellent instruments. So, yeah, I'm sorry it's not sounding any better. Usually, can be kind of a tough instrument to play if you're not playing it regularly. These modern instruments, you can really blow hard. These, if you overblow it, it's going to fight back, and it's not going to make any sound. So you have to play these much more gently because they're not intended to be loud. They're intended to be smooth and full. So, how are we doing? Okay. Well, so I can say lots more. And I usually say more than I need to. Just real quick, Crisis March. R.B.Hall lived during the Spanish-American War. And he had a publisher, and one of the issues, or one of the things that publishers wanted to do was support the cause. And so, and most composers did that. So they wrote music to support the troops or support the community, and the Crisis March is one of these, right? The Crisis March, he wrote this during the Spanish-American War, and if we look at this, one of the very common practices was to put in folk music that people would recognize. Because that would keep their interest. They're always looking for these folk songs or well-known tunes that they would have. And a lot of the airs, the musical airs, like the Star Spangled Banner wasn't the national anthem at this point. That didn't happen until 1931. There are a lot of airs. In this we see Hail Columbia, which now is the official song of the Vice President of the United States. We see other pieces in here. So what this is doing is it's called a characteristic march. And by that it means it's taking certain characteristics that you might hear with folk tunes or other familiar music, and it's putting it together, right? So the first part of it is the townspeople out celebrating as the troops leave to go into battle, to go to where they're going to go, right? So, right, so it's just a little folk tune, the town's gathering, they're sending off the troops, they're cheering them, they're saying, go get them. And then what we hear is then the troops going into battle, right? So there's going to be a tune. Hang on, I can see. Sorry, my eyes are failing me. Oh, whoops. I can't find it because it's not the right tune. I always do that with this. I always do the cursor and go in. All right. This is the one. This is the one. All right, now I'm seeing it. All right, so the tune that they're marching out to. All right, so that's them leaving town. Then they get to the point where they're going into battle. So that's the Hail Columbia, which is kind of a battle tune. Then in here, during the battle, you're thinking the troops really wish they weren't there, right? So they're doing this little theme of Home Sweet Home. And then the next part is everything's going crazy. They've got the battle, they're fighting each other, and then at the end, what you hear is the celebration for winning the battle, and that's the Star Spangled Banner. They won, all right? So, these are the types of things that composers were asked to do to help keep people in good spirits, okay? So R.B.Hall, as much as being a composer, was a storyteller and a historian. So in this case, it's the battles going into the Spanish-American War. He wrote a piece called Commonwealth, which depicted the celebration after Admiral George Dewey defeated the Spanish Armada. He came back a national hero in 1998, I think it was. He did a tour where he went to big cities and people would greet him and they would celebrate. And one of the places he went was Boston, the Commonwealth, right? And what it depicts is the scene of when George Dewey brings his fleet into the harbor and they march up to Boston Common and then they have a celebration. So you can hear very soft music, which is George Dewey approaching the Common. So it's like a sound where it's off in the distance and it gets louder and louder and louder until they're there. And then what you hear next is everyone celebrating. So the music gets very loud and very enthusiastic, and it's a party, right? And then at the end, they all leave, and it becomes quiet again. So that's where he tries to depict what is going on. He has another one, which is Appleton March, which is written for Appleton Street, which was the main parade route. And what you can hear in there, if you listen very carefully, couldn't find a recording of it. If you listen very carefully, you can hear as the parade progresses. So sometimes you hear a band very soft in the distance, and then you hear another one all of a sudden very loud because it's in front of you. You can hear the sounds of a steam calliope being drawn by horses. And then again, at the end, after the parade, it becomes very soft because everyone's left and now it's quiet. So he did a lot of that storytelling and a lot of being a historian to try and let people know what was actually happening during the major events. So I think I'll stop. If you have any, any questions.